UrbanTalk would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and the traditional owners of the land on which we record this podcast, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We recognise their continued connection to country and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to the UrbanTalk Podcast, the show where we bring together communities, planners, developers and fresh ideas to shape the cities we all call home. UrbanTalk is all about bridging the gap between the industry professionals building our neighbourhoods and the communities living in them. We're here to make conversations about urban development transparent, accessible and we hope exciting. In each episode, we'll unpack the issues, challenges and visions that shape our cities. I'm your host, Belinda Barnett. In this episode, we'll be discussing the YIMBY movement in the face of Australia's housing crisis and how advocates are pushing for more housing stock. To discuss this topic, I'm delighted to be speaking with the Deputy Chair of the advocacy group Sydney YIMBY and the founder and Managing Director of Sky Planning, Melissa Neighbour. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks, Belinda. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to have you. I've been really looking forward to discussing this topic with you. Most people listening probably already know that YIMBY, or the Yes in My Backyard movement, is a direct response to the Not in My Backyard, or NIMBY movement, but they may not be that familiar with what Sydney YIMBY is all about. It's a bit of a mouthful, that, Sydney YIMBY.
Lots of Y's.
To start off, can you first tell us about Sydney YIMBY and what they stand for?
Sure. So the YIMBY movement itself is actually a global movement. So we didn't come up with the name YIMBY, but Sydney YIMBY is really about saying yes to more homes, to more diversity and to better planning. And we have a very simple belief, and that is to address the affordability problems and to increase access to housing, we need to build more houses.
Okay. So what made you get involved with the YIMBY movement? What drew you to it?
Yeah, as a planner, I see the issues firsthand. I live and breathe them every single day. I've been doing planning in the industry for 20 years. And I think there's a bit of frustration that built up with me when I kept seeing good projects not come through the system and not be built because the culture, it's a cultural and a structural issue within the planning system. And that meant that while these weren't bad developments, they just weren't getting delivered. And so I wanted to, I suppose, find a vehicle for me to channel that frustration into something positive. And that's what I saw Sydney YIMBY as for me. A vehicle to advocate, to say we can do better.
Yep. When did Sydney YIMBY first start?
So the movement started around Q2 of 2023. So essentially what happened was there were quite a few ad hoc YIMBYs in Sydney, but there was not a coordinated group. And it wasn't until there was a council meeting in the Inner West to upzone a few blocks around a light rail station that at that meeting caused a lot of opposition. I think there were about 50 people there saying, no, we're not going to have this. And there were a couple of people in the room saying yes, and stood up and spoke in favour of it. And it was after that meeting that the yeses came together in the pub afterwards and just said, okay, I think we can do better and we can coordinate here and we're going to have to, because what just happened in there is not the future of Sydney. We can't let that continue. So yeah, that's how it sort of eventuated, and it's been growing and moving ever since.
And so how many members did you actually join Sydney YIMBY, become a member of the group?
I was part of the founding group. And that's then turned into a committee and an elected committee. And then I think at the moment we have about 350 members. So we are grassroots, we're volunteer, we really are the voice of the community. And any application for membership that comes through, we actually check it to make sure they're not a developer, because we do not speak on behalf of developers, we speak on behalf of the people who are locked out of the housing market. Renters make up a big majority of our membership. People who do own their own home but actually care about making the city inclusive and better, basically. So they're the people who are in our membership who want to see more homes for the sake of everyone.
Let's start by talking a little bit about the housing crisis. So we know that the National Housing Accord is an unprecedented push to increase housing supply across our nation. We've got an aspirational housing target of 1.2 million well-located homes across Australia in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
We've got a New South Wales target of 377,000 homes to be delivered between July 24 and July 2029. And while these numbers are significant, sometimes I feel that numbers don't actually capture the human face of what we're talking about when we're talking about a housing crisis. Meanwhile, you've just touched on in Sydney suburbs such as Wallara, Mossman, Ku-ring-gai, Inner West, we have groups of residents who are collaborating, looking at how they can collectively come together to address, fight housing density issues. And often these meetings that are occurring, they're being driven by fear of urban change, fear of growth. But you and I, we're both planners, and we know that our cities don't stand still. And we know that looking at historic photos of our skylines over the years, that just is further reinforcement that our cities don't stand still, and we have to look at how we absorb growth. And we know that the Minister for Housing, Claire O'Neill, has said on many occasions that the Housing Accord is trying to address a 40-year failure in increasing housing supply. So I think Sydney YIMBY, I think it's been very successful in articulating the case for density and starting this broader conversation. Can you share how Sydney YIMBY, I guess, how you see the current state of the Australian housing crisis, particularly in Sydney? What are the biggest factors driving affordability?
Yeah, well, you've given a really good summary of where things are at, which is great, because I think that context is important. Look, in terms of the factors driving it, we really focus on, at Sydney YIMBY, we focus on the planning controls. And we do that for a reason. Now, of course, there are lots of factors driving the housing crisis and the shortage of housing, right? Construction costs, we know they've gone up, labour shortages. There's a whole host of reasons. But the kind of concept or the visual that I like to think about it to help myself understand it is all of those issues are like a funnel in terms of housing delivery. And that housing delivery, it has to go through this funnel and all of those issues go in there. But at the very top of that funnel is the planning controls. So we need to make sure that the funnel is as wide as possible at the top to allow the potential for more sites to stack up and for housing to be built at the end of that development journey. And the problem at the moment is that the zoning is so restrictive and all the planning controls are so restrictive that we are choking, literally strangling the potential for supply of housing. So we need to fix that first. And that's where we're focusing. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you understand it like that. Me, Cone Planning and the Committee for Sydney did a report on this in 2022 called Planning for Growth. And what they showed was that, in fact, to meet the housing target, to meet the need, zoning at the moment is done for the capacity of what the target is. But actually, because of that development funnel, to factor in all the practical realities of delivering a home, it needs to be 7 times what that target is, what the need is. Now, that's huge if you think about that. We're nowhere near that at the moment. We're right now zoning just for the number. But we know that zoning doesn't mean it's going to deliver a home. So this is actually quite a radical rethink of how we zone, how we strategically plan for our areas, and the mindset that needs to come into the people of Sydney.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. I think the other thing that a lot of people don't understand is just the time frame around development. They hear about new controls coming in and they think it's going to be instantaneous change. That like in 12 months they're going to get, a 6-story or an 8-story or a 20-story building right next to them. And you and I know that those sort of lead times are just not, they just never happen.
They don't exist.
They don't exist.
Yes, it's true. Like even with the Wallara announcement for the GO station to be built and brought online with the 10,000 apartments. I mean, that there has got a lot of planning to be done yet. And there will be community consultation. And that's just the planning stage. I think it's like 10 years or something. And then we might start to see some homes. So it is a long time. And that enables the city to grow with the change.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, now, I guess community consultation is a really interesting one. Traditionally it seems to, the way it's sort of set up, particularly under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act and then sort of executed by councils, it seems to always primarily target property owners. And yet we know in our community, not everybody has achieved that status of property owner, and many never will, and many don't even aspire to. There's people that come to, I guess, the housing market with completely different aspirations. But that doesn't mean that their views shouldn't be incorporated into policy formulation. I guess, that's one of I guess another thing that I like about Sydney YIMBY, that you're sort of changing that dynamic. You are actually providing a voice for the broader community who don't automatically get heard. So, yeah, well done you.
Yeah, it feels like we're sort of bypassing a broken system and creating channels for, as you said, those people who don't typically get to have a voice to have one.
Yes, yeah, which is great.
Yeah.
Do you think that public perception fully grasps the scale and the urgency of the current housing situation?
I think it's starting to change in terms of the understanding of the severity of the crisis, but I think for many it still is an abstract idea. And I say that because we wouldn't be seeing so much opposition still if it was fully grasped. A year and a half ago, I spoke at the Nurses and Midwives Association conference for New South Wales. And during that conference, we got to speak with a lot of nurses and midwives. We actually were running a campaign at the time to support the upzoning of the Camperdown site, which is right near, which is a government-owned site right near the hospital there at RPA. And so we were asking them to write down their stories of how they're affected by the housing crisis, and we sent those postcards to the planning minister. And it was very confronting. I don't think anybody from the Sydney YIMBY team who were volunteering that day didn't cry at some point. People are sleeping in cars. People are they're sharing beds. It was really full on. And then if you then, that's sort of, I guess, the severity of it. But if you then pull it back to sort of a more societal level as opposed to individual, one nurse told me, so she was working at a hospital in Western Sydney, and she lived in Newcastle. And so she was driving because she couldn't afford to live in Sydney. And she was driving 2 hours for each shift. And she also mentioned to me that the equipment that she used, so she treated children with cancer. So the radiation equipment, she said, was getting used half of the time because there weren't enough staff to run it. Wow. And she now no longer works at that. She's now moved to a hospital in Newcastle. So that's the broader societal impacts that this housing crisis is causing.
Yeah. And as I said, it's like we focus on the numbers, but we don't see that human face. It doesn't get talked about, I don't think, nearly enough. Do you think the current initiatives by the New South Wales government, like the statutory planning reforms that looking to reduce red tape and approval timeframes, the 30% density and height uplifts for affordable housing provision, the establishment of a new housing delivery authority, and I guess the opportunity for housing projects to be progressed as state significant development, and the low and yet to be seen medium rise pattern book are steps in the right direction?
Look, absolutely. And as you're saying all of that, you can probably see my smile. I'm beaming with a big smile because it's actually quite incredible what the state government has done, and even what's happening at the local level as well. We're seeing lots of mayors and local councils come together to push forward the housing agenda. So it's so incredible to see such a strong push towards these reforms that can deliver more housing. We still have a long way to go, but I do know that it's given what's been quite a stagnated planning system, it's started to create that sort of feeling of movement and change and hope. And that's all important to getting to where we need to be.
That's great. Are you seeing a big difference, I guess, in attitude when you touched on mayors? Are you seeing a difference in attitude, say, between mayors of say, Western Sydney or the like the Penriths and the Fairfields compared to our inner city mayors?
Look, I think there is a general disconnect there in terms of established suburbs versus newer suburbs, because the newer suburbs are used to the change, whereas established suburbs are many people who live there want to maintain the status quo. And look, comes back to the system itself, which is, and I can see that local authorities are stuck between a rock and a hard place because they've had decades of wanting to keep a community, their community's expectations upheld. And now we have to also build new homes. So that's where we need to, I guess, as I was saying before, bypass the system and show that there are people who want more homes, and that they need to be represented and heard just as much. And I think that is also becoming now more of a responsibility of the established councils as well.
Okay. Are there other policy changes that Sydney YIMBY is advocating for that would have an immediate impact on increasing housing supply?
I think one of the biggest levers we could pull would be to upzone further. So every residential zone property across Sydney, if that could be a minimum of 3 stories for residential development, whether it's townhouses or low-rise residential flat buildings, but as a base minimum, 3 stories of residential is permitted everywhere. And then obviously even further upzoning around our stations.
So we get rid of the R2 low density zone?
Or keep it, but that suddenly becomes medium density.
Yeah, increase the heights.
Let's do it.
Let's talk a little bit about the NIMBY versus YIMBY dynamic. There's sometimes a perception that YIMBYs back development at any cost. How do you address that criticism?
I think that's a myth. We want to see great cities. We want to live in great cities. And so we are definitely promoting sustainable, human-scaled developments that can drive amenity. And that's what we need to drive amenity. Density does drive amenity. But I think where it gets a little bit more nuanced is that we are not about perfection. We want to see progress before perfection. And I think every delay, every refusal, that has a human cost. And so I think it's important to realize that sometimes things may not be completely perfect, but as long as we strive for the best that we can and still deliver housing, I think that's the right balance.
Okay. What are the core differences, I guess, between the YIMBY and NIMBY mindsets when it comes to housing and urban development? Surely we must recognise that there's a difference between individuals expressing legitimate concerns about new development and urban policy and, I guess, the broad scale sort of NIMBY criticism. How and where does Sydney YIMBY draw that line?
Yeah, I really like this question. I think it's just so important to think about, for all of us to think about. But the way I thought about this is that I feel like NIMBYs say, don't change my street, and YIMBYs are saying, let's share my street. But in that, the fundamental difference is that YIMBYs believe that change will actually be good, be great. We welcome the change. We see it as a positive thing. Whereas NIMBYs, to simplify it, are saying, I don't want the change because it will be bad. Yeah. So there's this underlying perceived fear of change. And I think that actually is the biggest difference in mindset. YIMBYs really see housing as a collective responsibility and as a social justice issue. And that, while concerns can be legitimate and are, sometimes they are, the other flip side of that is that sometimes they're weaponized. So we've seen things where, say, infrastructure is labelled as an issue. And often NIMBYs, what they will do is they create a flyer of all of the issues to represent what the concerns are. Sometimes we'll see things like local public school over, at capacity or too full, can't take any more children, where in actual fact, it's the opposite.
Yes.
So these aren't truths sometimes. And I think the problem with that is then it discredits those people who do have legitimate concerns. And that goes both ways as well. But that's really, I think, one of the key problems there is weaponizing these concerns.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, because very often, I mean, our suburbs, many of our established suburbs, are getting old. Their infrastructure is getting old. Yeah. They actually need this investment in new development to retrofit them. It's the developers who are actually funding the upgrades in utilities. I think a lot of NIMBY thinking residents may not turn their minds to that. They think that, state governments or councils are going to come along and solve the problems with upgrading and investing in new infrastructure, but they don't have the money. I mean, we see that with all the potholes on the roads, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, I guess standing by and there's somebody sort of who works in community consultation, I always think that is a narrative that goes undiscussed when we talk about new projects, that whole sort of, well, what is the actual cost the project's going to place on infrastructure? There's a lot more to that argument.
There is, and you're right. The fact is that in Australia, rightly or wrongly, it is the market that delivers housing, most of it anyway, 95% of it, and that means they also deliver amenity that comes with that, or infrastructure. Yeah. But just something interesting that I learnt the other day when I was at a housing conference, I was speaking to the head of Sydney Water, and she said something pretty cool, which was that because of the concerted effort that Sydney siders have made to reduce their water usage over the past decade, we've gone from 400 litres per person usage, I can't remember if it was annual or week, down to 200 per person.
Fantastic.
200 litres per person.
Cut it by half.
We've cut it by half. So go us.
Go us, yeah.
But what she then said on the back of that is, there's so much capacity now in the system. And they love infill development because there's so much capacity, and to have to build on the fringe costs Sydney Water so much money. It's a waste of resources and money. So that's why, sometimes that infrastructure debate gets a little bit weaponised.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. Yimbys have certainly become much more visible in media outlets, and because media is getting behind the movement. And Sydney YIMBY is often described as the new political power in the housing crisis. Your advocacy is definitely, as I said before, giving a voice to those that have gone unheard. However, it seems that media coverage is often framed as a battle between NIMBYs on one side and YIMBYs on the other. Does that concern you?
It does, to a degree. I think it's the nature of the game right now. And what I mean by that is, and I just want to give a bit of context here, for decades, objectors and people who don't want to see development, they're the ones who've basically ruled the city and defined how development comes out. There's never been a coordinated yes. Yeah. And so inherently, by having the pendulum swung so far towards a culture of no, it almost needs a reset, a correction. Yeah. And to do that, you need to have a clear yes. Yeah. So I feel like we're at the start of that. I would hope that eventually that can, fall away. But I think while we're in the start of this journey of turning towards a pro-housing, pro-development city, that clear yes is actually needed. And also the other positive side of it being so simple is that while these issues are, they're still being grasped by the general public. Planning suddenly is having a day in the sun, so it's great. I love that the general public are talking about these issues and starting to understand planning and understand housing and development. And I think while it's at this infancy where it's starting to spread and people are understanding it, just having a clear in to go, okay, well, there's yes and no, there's more to it. But once they come into this conversation through that easy hook, they can start to build their own perspective. Yeah,
no, I agree with you entirely. NIMBY arguments often focus, they're always anti-density. We've talked about they focus on infrastructure, strain, loss of heritage often comes up, particularly in suburbs like Ku-ring-gai and Mossman. Impact on local character. Our place is, I've heard this a lot of times in consultation, our place is special, I'm not against density. It can, I'm very for density. I know we need more housing, but just not here. How do you respond? How does Sydney YIMBY, that's a real mouthful. Sydney YIMBY respond to those concerns?
There are 4 Y's in those words. So
that's a lot.
Yeah. I think it goes back to what your great question before around the difference in mindset. And I think that often NIMBYs, as I said, they blatantly fear change. And so they immediately see change as a bad thing, and that we actually see it as a good thing. And so we believe that new housing and retaining or evolving heritage and culture are not mutually exclusive. They can work together. We can evolve our cities and still retain heritage appropriately, and build density appropriately around heritage. And the fact is, like, what I don't know, this is maybe just my personal views, but like, I don't understand why previous heritage is more important than future heritage. It's a strange thing, because I want to see what Sydney looks like in the future.
Yeah.
And I would be kind of sad if it just looked the way it still does now.
Yeah, and look, and we have exceptional, architectural talent in this country, exceptional architects. I always talk about, another thing that I don't think gets talked about enough is this sort of investment in the architectural wealth of our suburbs. So I think that's exactly to your point. It's about, let's see, what this generation of architects can deliver, and in terms that will become heritage for future generations.
Yes. And the previous generations, they got to have a go at creating the city, but we can't just close it off now. Yeah. What about the future generations, as you said, Belinda? Yeah.
I don't believe, I guess, our governments take enough time to educate communities about the need for urban growth. We know firsthand, and you've talked about it extensively, how much people fear change. And I've always thought that the education piece around urban policy formulation was far too light on. A political agenda is launched, a new policy response is flaunted, and all too often that policy response has been formed behind closed doors. We might read in the introduction to that policy, that it's been developed in conjunction with industry stakeholders, whatever the hell that statement means. There is this cloak of secrecy that suddenly, I think, exists around new policy when it comes to urban development. And I guess as the governments look to cut red tape and reduce approval timeframes, I fear that this will translate, I guess, into a further erosion of community consultation about new development and urban policy. What opportunities does Sydney YIMBY see, I guess, to facilitate more constructive discussions and community consultation with people that may be reluctant to embrace urban change?
Yeah, really good points. And I think, or maybe I'll just address it in 2 points. I'll say what Sydney YIMBY is doing. But I do think that the government has a responsibility to play a greater role in providing the right information and more information to Sydney-siders, to people who live in these cities. Because I think what happens is we don't understand sometimes the impact of a position we take. So those broader social factors don't get weighed into everything that we're thinking about all the time. And that's, I think that's a missed opportunity there, is to talk about the pros and cons of things and to allow people to then to make a decision that's more informed. But in terms of Sydney YIMBY, we're really using social media to comment and provide a space for debate around certain developments, what our city could look like, what it should look like. We certainly run a lot of, workshops and things like that for people to understand the system itself. I think that's a big part of it, is that people don't even know how to have a voice if they even wanted to, especially young people. So there's a big disconnect there. And I think I don't know if Sydney YIMBY can solve all the problems. I think it's got to be a collective effort.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't think you can solve all the problems at all. But you're shining a light on them. So that's a really big start. But, I do believe there's the whole consultation sort of piece when we're talking about policy starts way too late. And I don't think people are given options. So one roadway is put out there, one solution is put out there for us all to follow, rather than maybe going back to grassroots and looking at, when I was at university, going way back, but there was a lot of attention paid to scenario planning you looked at different scenarios, the what ifs. So what if, if you went this way or you went that way? And I think a lot of that has been lost from our policy formulation context. And I personally think that's a bit of a shame. So people don't get choice. They don't get that ability to think about, okay, well, this is what we need. This is the goal. This is what we need. We need to have 1.2 million homes across Australia. Like, what are the various options that we could take with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great framing to help that conversation around weighing up different positives and negatives. And as you said, like, we need to build that housing. It has to go somewhere. What do we want that to look like?
I think it was an interesting insight to that was Ku-ring-gai Council, I think, recently, when they have rejected the state government's, housing targets for the area and all the way they were meant to be delivered. And then they went ahead and then they engaged consultants to come up with their own series of options. Now, I personally was quite shocked when I deep dived into some of those options and some of the heights of the towers, like the community was putting forward as being acceptable, weighing that off against, like, to preserve heritage conservation in the area. Like, I wasn't expecting those sorts of outcomes. I mean, it was an interesting exercise, I think, that the council went through. I'm not quite. You might know exactly where that's up to now. I'm not 100% sure where it's gone to.
I'm not sure exactly where it's at now, but yes, you're right. They basically wanted to put all the housing in one small area.
Yeah, Gordon.
Yeah, and everything else stay the same.
Yeah. It was interesting, but at least they, I guess to my point, they had the opportunity to go through options.
Yes, exactly. At the start, than here's one option, make some comments on that one option. Yeah, I get you. I like it.
And it was done, I think, it was done at a local level. And, there's a lot of criticism that's always put at local councils, but we've got to recognise they are the closest level to community.
Yes.
Closest level of government to community. So, I thought it was a really interesting exercise to work through. So the word density, it's polarising, isn't it? And again, the focus gets put on the numbers. What's the FSR? What's the height? How does Sydney YIMBY reframe the narrative around higher density housing?
Yeah, I think it's not... it is. It does have a bit of a dirty connotation to it, and it can be polarising. I was thinking about this when you put this question in. I was thinking maybe we should just reframe it all together. I'm thinking something like neighbourhood abundance, or like lifestyle abundance. This suburb has an abundance of lifestyle, which essentially means, because we know that the more people in an area, the more that area can sustain great amenity and services and cafes and libraries and gyms and all the things that make a neighbourhood fantastic. That comes with density, So yeah, I don't know. Maybe we should maybe I think it needs its own little marketing, campaign around changing it to something like lifestyle abundance.
I think you're touching on an interesting point. I think the word amenity means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Like I'm in your mindset, like a good amenity to me is sort of an activated lifestyle. I've got choice. I can wander to the cafe. I've got sort of some nice walks to do, through nice open space. I can walk everywhere. I don't have to actually get out and, start my car. So like the word, but to other people, that may not be amenity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think
single detached houses.
Yes.
And only that. That's
and only
amenity.
That's amenity.
That's a nice treat, of course.
A quiet lifestyle.
And look, I think that is also amenity, but in the context of a city and a city of millions and millions and millions of people, I just don't think that is reasonable.
So then what role does design and amenity play in overcoming opposition to new housing developments? Like particularly design, again, very subjective. What is good design? Because we can drive around the streets and we can see a lot of, medium to high density projects that have been completed that are not looking great. They've been completed maybe in the last 5 years. They're not holding up well.
Yes, and I think this is the part of the problem again is that a lot of trust has been broken in terms of, okay, we're going to have something come into my street. What is it going to look like? The New South Wales government created an interactive digital map to showcase great development across Sydney. And that's a really good tool. And I think that's an important part of the conversation is that development can be done well. And I think there is a commitment from the government to deliver high quality housing. We've seen it with the pattern book, the investment behind that. And so as we were saying before, just because something gets zoned doesn't mean it's going to instantly equal a home. It still needs to go through that development process and the planning process, which will assess it on its merits. And with that commitment coming from the government, I do hope that we would be seeing a lot more high quality developments.
Yeah. I was really impressed when I looked at the low-rise pattern book. I think it's been a tremendous body of work by the state government and particularly the government architect. I really loved the designs that have been put forward. I actually felt that, for me, they captured the Australian way of life. I could imagine that, it was creating a different social dynamic, which I thought would really go back to helping community at a grassroots level. I can imagine living in one of those designs, whether it's a manor house or a terrace or a villa, and knowing my neighbour and, doing that old sort of fashion thing of borrowing a cup of sugar over the fence. I love the way they address the street, which, we haven't seen in a lot of, we do see it, but there's a lot of projects where you don't see it. They turn their back on the street.
Yes.
So much.
Yes.
So a frequent NIMBY argument that's often put forward is that increasing housing supply and offering first home buyer incentives won't make housing affordable. That it might deliver some more housing, but who's going to live in it? Is it really going to solve the housing crisis? What's the Sydney YIMBY response to that argument?
There's a whole body of research across the world, not just in Australia, that shows that more supply of any kind will bring down prices overall. So it's important that we allow more supply to come in, even if it is at that higher end, because that actually triggers a chain of moves. And overall, over time, prices do get evened out across the board. It's not an overnight change, but it has to happen. We need more houses.
Yes.
And so I think it's important that we stop using that as an excuse to say no and just allow what's feasible to be built at the time. Again, if we were to upzone even further, more sites would stack up. We might have a chance of not just luxury stacking up at the moment and have a bigger chance, but we then have to say yes to that upzoning. So at the moment, it just seems like we're saying no, no, no. But I will say that we do need to, Sydney YIMBY absolutely support social housing, public housing. We want to see housing of all kinds being built. But the reality is why we focus on the market is because it's, as we said before, 95% of housing in this country is delivered by the market. That's the biggest lever we can pull. So that's where we focus.
Let's talk about vision. What the vision and the key action priorities for Sydney YIMBY going forward. I'd love to hear some examples about some of the examples that Sydney YIMBY advocacy has successfully influenced.
Great question. Well, I think probably our biggest win, aside from just the fact that we've created a new conversation in the media and the headlines.
Which is huge.
Yeah. I think it would have to be Inner West Council. We've seen the biggest change. Inner West Council was a NIMBY council for quite a long time, to the extent where when we first started to band together the YIMBY group, there was a proposal being put forward by the council to heritage list, I think it was 8 or 9 substations, electrical substations. Which, of course, as soon as that happens, development can't happen around it, can't happen So we were really concerned about that. We ran a media campaign and that got a bit of traction because it was quite a ridiculous proposal. So that didn't get up. And in fact, since then, over the last couple of years, we've seen that council really turn around to now being a leader in the housing agenda and have put forward, they did similar to what Ku-ring-gai have done in terms of creating their own plan for housing rather than accepting the TOD and the LMR from the state. And they are looking at delivering that has the potential to deliver over over 30,000 homes. So that's probably been one of the biggest changes I think that we've seen in terms of drastic change. But there's been lots of little wins. And I think for me, just on a personal front, it's just been so great to work with such dedicated volunteers. It's just been really rewarding. So for me, that's just a personal win, is the opportunity to work with people that I do.
Yeah. So what does your ideal Sydney look like if the Sydney YIMBY principles guide its growth?
I will say I'd like to kind of build on what you said before about that Australian way of life. I would love to see that community spirit alive and well in our city. We do have a loneliness epidemic. It's actually a crisis also. I'd love to see that eradicated through better design and, denser, or what do we say, lifestyle abundant neighbourhoods. I'd love to see that, and more bikes, more walking, all that kind of thing would be great.
How can everyday people who may not be homeowners who support more housing best make their voices heard, given that opposition groups are highly organised?
And they are.
Yeah, they very much are.
I would say join Sydney YIMBY. I'll give a plug for our membership. Come join the team. We'd love to have you. And also, you can just show up at your local council meeting. It's incredible the impact that has. Councillors are at those council meetings making a vote, and often it's based on whoever comes to that meeting and what they have to say. And if they just hear no, 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 well, they're going to feel like they're doing the right thing if they represent those views. So we need more people to show up. And also, just get on board with our campaigns, stay across the issues. The best way to do that is just to sign up to our newsletter as well. It's free. And that will keep you across the issues. And then things that are important to you, you can get involved with.
I think it's a really good point. And, when I run community consultation, I often say this to, as part of workshops and stuff, I always say, look, when something goes on public exhibition, don't be afraid to say you like it.
Yes.
Like, that whole notification and submission process, it isn't just geared to objections. There's not enough letters of support written. And that particularly applies to some, development classes. I mean, I've done a lot of consultation with seniors living in aged housing, which we need far more of, given our ageing population. And for some reason, those projects can be some of the most controversial. I mean, I've heard some shocking statements by people just coming along to those sorts of consultations, things like, I don't want to live next to old people, which is just disgraceful. You can't even believe that it comes out of some people's mouths. And, other consultation events to do with those sorts of projects, you're able to actually draw a line down, say, the middle of a room where people on one side are wanting to give you a check right now to secure a place in a proposed aged care facility or seniors housing development, and the other people on the other side saying, well, we don't want it. So, it is really it's really important that if you do believe in something, to express that view.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, writing letters of support are important. It's funny how if we don't like something, you kind of have a lot more drive to go and say no to it. Whereas if you like something, you're like, oh yeah, I like that, that'll be good. But you're not going to then go and write a support. But it's actually so important to moving Sydney forward. So yeah, get involved, say yes.
Exactly. So looking ahead, what are Sydney YIMBY's major priorities over the short term?
I think it's just remaining that positive voice for development. It's so important that we keep that coordinated yes, that we build the movement. I would love to see us have more members, because I think in the politicians' eyes, that's important, right? If we're then saying, yes, we want something, they can just see that broad membership and go, wow, this is really important to people who live in Sydney. So I'd love to see our membership grow. And I'd really, we'll just be, as I said, that coordinated yes. And also, including, I guess, keeping people across the issues. So training is really important, helping people to understand how they can have a say in the system and engage with the planning system. That's important work for us as well. So that's where our focus will be.
And if you could deliver one message to political leaders about housing, what would it be?
I would say be bold, be courageous, and do not give up now. Do not stop. We are just at the start of this. Sydney has a long way to grow, to mature, And to turn the ship around of young people leaving, we need more courageous policy. So please keep going for future generations' sake.
Yeah, exactly, and more bipartisan cooperation. I think it's great that the current planning minister has been dealing with the shadow planning minister and looking at a spirit of cooperation. You know, we have to deal with short political terms, and so that's really the only way forward, particularly when it comes to planning, particularly because of the lead times, to get that level of cooperation when it comes to policy formulation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great to see.
Well, Melissa Neighbour, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the Urban Talk podcast. I have really loved our conversation and deep diving into Sydney YIMBY. I think by the end of it, I can say it better than when I started. So practice does make perfect.
Yes, you've seen it here.
And thank you both personally and for your group's advocacy in this area. It's really important and you really are making a difference.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for letting me share the Sydney YIMBY story. We really appreciate it.
If you have questions or thoughts to share, click the link in our show notes. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're a developer or working on a project that needs an online presence or community engagement, please reach out to UrbanTalk. You can do that through the same link, or alternatively, you can visit urbantalk.com.au. Don't forget to follow, leave a rating and a review. It really helps people find our podcast and it keeps these important conversations going. I'm Belinda Barnett and thank you for listening to the Urban Talk podcast.
Consulting with the community about your proposed development or planning project can be daunting and challenging, especially when media and local action groups drive public perception. But now there's a cost-effective way to avoid misrepresentation and ease public tension and resistance towards your project. Introducing UrbanTalk. UrbanTalk is Australia's first property development and community engagement platform. Establish a digital presence for your project that raises community awareness, answers questions, and promotes greater understanding of urban planning and development. Intuitive templates, developed using 30 years of community consultation experience, allow you to easily create a comprehensive listing for your project. Populating fields with information already at hand, your project listing becomes the community information hub, a source of truth that provides straightforward explanations, images, videos, and centralises all inquiries. Your listing is supported by site signage, notification postcards, and newsletters that direct people to the page, with the ability to track public interest in the project. Now you can provide a reliable source of information in English and 10 other languages, creating an avenue for inquiry to gain community trust and improve the path to project approval. Create your project listing today.